G'day. The significant disease investigation that I want to present today revolves around stock horses. The presentation was nothing unusual. It was, I have horses losing nick despite being on good feed, and I've lost a few and others are missing. I don't know what's causing it. Can you come and help us? The time and location for this is between late September to December in 2020. It's on Spring Creek Station, which sits below Lake Argyle on the Ord River, up against the Northern Territory WA border. It extends from the border across to the Ord River and then follows the Negri across back to the border. My case definition is simply multiple horse deaths following a period of chronic weight loss. It's the multiple horse deaths that makes it an SDI. The thing that's unusual is that it's simply chronic weight loss is really the only presenting sign that was presented to me prior to their death. My differential diagnosis list, at the top of that was intoxication and principally Kimberley walkabout disease caused by Crotalaria species, which is very common in the Kimberley. But at this point, there had been no neurological signs seen with these cases, which usually accompanies this disease. It could be another plant, it could be a feed contaminant in hay, it could be infectious, either endemic disease or an exotic disease. But these horses were fairly remote and isolated, so I considered this to be fairly unlikely. The initial investigation formally started on the 30th September 2020. Blood samples were taken from 3, 5 to 6-year-old stock horses, primarily to evaluate their liver function, trying to rule in or out Crotalaria poisoning. Other than being light in condition, there were no neurological signs, depression, diarrhea, or respiratory signs, nasal discharge, coughing, or exercise intolerance, noting how they walked sprightly and with ears pricked the 500 plus metres down to where I was working at the time to have their blood samples taken. The laboratory findings, hematology was fairly insignificant. Fibrinogen was slightly elevated, white blood cells were down. The biochemistry though, the liver enzymes were normal. The only other significant abnormality was that the albumin was down, the globulins were up, and so the ratio, the albumin-globulin ratio was down. The laboratory summary of this was that there's simply some chronic active inflammatory response going on in the horse, and that the absence of hepatic disease suggests that pyrolydene alkaloid toxicity is unlikely. The other horse, Haram Hall, was the same picture. Liver enzymes normal and the same pattern with the albumin and globulins. And similar response, summary, inflammatory response, absence of hepatic disease suggesting that pyrolydene alkaloid toxicity is not involved. Cowboy, the third horse, did have slightly elevated GLDH, but not that significant. So in this horse, there was some evidence of a mild hepatocellular injury, but there was no evidence of cholestasis, and that all the other changes were mild and non-specific. So we don't have sufficient evidence of significant hepatic disease or damage causing the chronic wasting presented here, and there's no clinical neurological evidence of a hepatoencephalopathy seen terminally with pyrolydene alkaloids also. So I guess I have to, for this stage, rule out Kimberley walkabout disease. And what do we have? We just have a vague inflammatory process. Hematology also suggests that the process is not bacterial or infectious in origins. So we need to dig deeper to get some fresh leads. This was not far off when, about a week later, Apache, having continued to deteriorate with rapid weight loss and starting to show terminally dyspnea and tachypnea, I was called in to euthanize the horse and do a post-mortem. And that's when we made our first major breakthrough. The gross PM showed severe lung consolidation, edema and emphysema. the lungs didn't collapse and there were rib impressions on the lungs. One thing that surprised me, though, with the extent and severity of the pathology, I would have expected to have seen more respiratory signs, that these were not more pronounced earlier on, other than just terminally. Looking at the histopathology report on this horse Apache, even though there was some hepatocellular megalocytosis, it was only mild, but the most common or most prominent changes were in the lungs, obviously, same as what I could see on the gross. But they concluded that the etiology was most likely toxic, even though herpes virus or a neoplastic etiology was considered. It seemed to support that a toxic origin, and that there are some pyrrolizidine alkaloids in plants that can cause mainly pulmonary disease rather than the more common hepatic changes, and that these lesions have been described in horses and donkeys elsewhere. So it seems as though from the histopathology that these gross pathology lesions have been the result of a toxic insult and possibly an ingested pyrrolizidine alkaloid. We'll note here also that African horse sickness had been ruled out by the histopathology, and this is important, particularly since there's been a recent occurrence of the disease in Malaysia. So it is getting closer to our doorstep, and we need to be looking out and ruling out such exotics. Haram Hall, one of the other horses, which also had no signs of liver changes in the blood sampling, continued to deteriorate with rapid weight loss. And I flew in on the 22nd of October to find the horse had died 20 minutes before I landed, but it was still suitable to conduct a PM. The pathology was the same as Apache, with severe lung consolidation, edema, emphysema. And once again, I was surprised that I hadn't seen respiratory signs earlier on. Just to give a picture of how these horses present clinically terminally, this horse, Comanche, was presented to me after I had finished the post-mortem on Haram Hall. As you can see that we have this dyspnea and tachypnea.
All start just by doing that.
This horse was euthanized the next day, and the owners did a post-mortem and it showed the same gross pathology. So we are seeing a very consistent picture emerge, animals with severe lung pathology. The histopathology on Haram Hall on the samples I submitted from the second post-mortem was, once again, we had a severe proliferative bronchoalveolar pneumonia with specifically Claricell hyperplasia. The report went on to suggest that the possibility of a disease called Jazesket disease, which is a chronic progressive respiratory disease of horses and mules resulting from the ingestion of certain Crotalaria species in Africa. In these horses, you also see pulmonary histopathology of bronchial epithelial hyperplasia, and specifically also Claricell hyperplasia. Once again, there's some mild, moderate megalocytosis of the hepatocytes, and this is also noted in this Jazesket disease. You get some megalocytosis, which may or may not accompany the pulmonary changes. So what we're seeing here is the histopathology is consistent with a chronic progressive respiratory syndrome seen in South Africa called Jazesket disease. So my revised differential diagnosis is that even though the histopathology supports a toxic agent inducing lung pathology and is strongly pointing to a plant toxin, but to be thorough, I wanted to rule out alternative sources of such a toxin. You know, could it be from the toxin from hay, contaminant, plant, mycotoxin? Could it be a toxin from the homestead yards, either plants or chemical residues that were left over from a recent neem tree eradication campaign? Or is it a toxin from the paddock where these horses have been spelled, the racecourse paddock? Be it a plant, could it be a water contaminant, algal bloom? So to help be more specific and narrow this down, I went about doing a timeline and mapping the movement and the history of these horses. This is the paper version of what I drew up, trying to get a grip on the history and of the movement and where the deaths occurred. We're dealing primarily with two locations, the racecourse paddock and the homestead yards where they were fed hay. To see this on the map, the racecourse paddock is in the southern end of the property. Hay has been fed at the homestead, and horses have been moved back and forwards between these two locations throughout the last 12 or 18 months. Going back to our timeline, in November of 2019, the horses were returned to the homestead because of surface water ran out at the end of the season in the racecourse paddock. The horses were held here until there was adequate break in the season, which didn't occur until about the 10th of February, when they were returned to the racecourse paddock. It was then that the first horse was found dead when they went to move these horses. About a month later, the season having finished early, stock horses were brought in to start getting a working plant together. 16 horses were brought in and one older horse, Jaffa, who died a couple of days after being brought in. About a month later, most of these horses were returned to the racecourse paddock to be replaced with a fresh batch of horses and younger horses. These, about 3 to 4 weeks later, were returned back to the racecourse paddock, and it was then that one of these horses was found dead next to the trough a few days later. More horses were brought back to the homestead for the working plant, some breakers and a few other older horses. And it was then that it was noted in the pen that more horses were missing, and the penny began to drop that there was a problem back in this horse, and that horses that were missing or were noted to be in poor condition and now missing obviously had died. And so working back along their notes and their diaries, it was roughly in this timeline that these horses died. 2 more horses that were in poor condition were brought back towards the end of September, and it was at this point that the owner decided to bring all the horses back because he knew there had to be a problem in this paddock. Shortly after they were brought back, 2 horses were euthanized because they deteriorated so rapidly. It was at this point that I was brought in to take blood samples, and shortly after that, about a week later, I was called in to do the autopsy on Apache. A week later, I was called in to do the autopsy on Neum Hall, and also the next day Comanche died. Not long after that, another couple of horses died and postmortems were conducted, all having the same growth pathology. In gathering this history, it was also noted that the horses were brought back in April, and the ones that stayed there the whole time at the homestead were on hay for the whole time, and none of these horses died. So if there was a problem with the hay, I thought it would have shown up in those horses as much as amongst any horses. There would be problems in that group, but there wasn't. So the evidence is supporting what the owner suspected, that the problem is back in the racecourse paddock. Just while I have the timeline there, towards the end of November, I took more blood samples from horses that were looking a little bit suspect or had been exposed to that racecourse paddock for most of the season. 4 of these 5 horses were found later died, but none of them showed any significant blood changes, be it biochemistry or hematology. So our problem lies down here in the racecourse paddock, the southern end of the property. So I requested the services of Kate Ryan from the Ag Department to do a plant survey of this paddock. And the main finding that Kath had, a significant finding, was that of Trichodempsia xylantium, or camelbush. And this picture here shows one of these plants that had been heavily grazed. A picture of the plant with its grey, hairy leaves with white or blue flowers. And this map showing that it is quite widely distributed over Australia. These pictures of the plants of the camel bush were taken when I took the last lot of blood samples. There had been some rain from when the survey was originally done, and one thing that the owner commented on is just how much camel bush was there, that since the rain there were a lot more fresh suckered plants. As you can see here, fresh shoots from the base of these stems, but there were also plenty of other fresh shoots. On this plant, on the last photo there, we can see the white flower and pods, very hairy leaves and hairy pods. So going back to our histopathology report, in that report, it was reported that there are other pyrrolizidine alkaloid containing plants which have been associated with respiratory disease in horses, including Zycodempsia xylanthium, or camel bush, and that ingestion of these plants have been associated with chronic pulmonary emphysema and mortality in horses, and causing similar pulmonary pathology as to that seen in Joseph disease. So my diagnosis is that we have pyrrolizidine alkaloids from the plant Trichodempsia xylanthium, camel bush, inducing chronic pulmonary pathology that resulted in a syndrome similar to Joseph disease. I'm not going to go into the actual process of how this pulmonary pathology is incited. I'll leave that up to Rick at last when he gives his comments on this case. Clinically, these horses presented to me primarily with chronic weight loss, some reduced exercise tolerance, and terminally with dyspnea and tachypnea. So what are the recommendations of the client? Obviously to remove them from the source of the problem. And they've set about doing this by establishing better facilities at the homestead to enable feeding of hay on a larger scale and for longer until the season breaks. They've also gone back to returning these horses to the northern part of the property once the season breaks and there's adequate green feed. In previous years, when they had taken and left the horses in that area, they believed they had losses from whitewood poisoning. And the theory is that these plants were the only ones with green, fresh leaves on them, and that the horses were attracted to them. Whitewood poisoning is quite well documented in horses. What are the lessons that struck me about this case? New lessons and old lessons reinforced. Probably the first thing with this case and this syndrome is that the lack of changes in the hematology and biochemistry, which made early diagnosis or diagnosis from blood sampling very challenging, which is very different to the normal Kimberley walkabout disease caused by pyrrolizidine alkaloids. Camel bush has not been well documented, not as well documented as Crotalaria species. And also pyrrolizidine alkaloid activation by the pulmonary pathway and not a hepatic pathway has not been that well documented, at least in Australia. Historically, there were massive horse losses in this region back in the 1950s and 60s in the area, in the vicinity of 170 to 200 horses, but no definitive diagnosis was reached. And so I feel it's important that we build up our database and properly document cases like this. It reinforces the importance of doing thorough postmortems and being thorough with in our observations, in our sampling techniques. It also reinforced the importance of a thorough history, mapping and timelines to help us narrow down and target our investigation and help us to come to a specific diagnosis. The importance of working as a team is once again reinforced. Use the expertise available, pathologists and agronomists, and I certainly wasn't able to make progress on this case without their expert advice. Clearly, the need to persevere, as this was extended over a few months and had to be revisited a number of times, but it was important. And my last point, the importance of communication, and particularly with the owners. This case was very devastating for them. They love their horses, and to lose this many horses that they had invested a lot of energy, time and money into, was devastating. I had to encourage them that we would get to the bottom of this, and I believe that we have. Just to conclude with an update, a better season has set in, and so they have been able to relocate these horses to the northern of the property. But at the time that we did this, there were 25 mortalities out of a horse plant of 60, and that's only so far. That's fairly devastating. Just to give an pictorial appreciation of this, these young, fresh, healthy looking horses at the beginning season, now this horse is dead, this horse is dead, and this horse has a big question mark hanging over them, as it wasn't looking very good, very healthy when it was taken up to the northern part of the property at the end of the season. So I hope that you found this interesting. It was certainly a challenging case, and I've certainly learnt a lot from this case, like I do from each case that I investigate. So thank you.